my take on the first chapter is one where I kind of juxtapose fact versus fiction, kind of set up that idea that not everything is as we've been led to believe. And that's kind of the essence of economics in general, and in particular international economics, that there's a lot of things that are counterintuitive. A lot of things are the exact opposite of what you may think. So with that in mind, we'll go through and set up some of the things we'll be talking about the rest of this semester. So this is more of an introductory chapter, just kind of get us off on the right foot, introduce some of the concepts and topics so that you have a framework for the rest of the semester. And that's basically where we're going with this. And I'll be using my smartboard here as best I can. And these things I will publish online as well for you guys to look at if need be. There we go. So, what's the first fact versus fiction? As you recall, we were talking about how this idea that you should be self-reliant, that you should not depend upon other people, is somewhat misguided. It's not the way individuals function. It's not the way the world works. We as individuals, specialize in a particular job, and then we trade our services for the services and goods that are manufactured by other people's labor resources, and that raises our standard of living. And the point is, that's the same way countries work. Countries do better when they specialize, as we'll see, kind of in the things that they're good at, but there's a little caveat there. But just for purposes right now, specialize in the thing you're good at and trade for the things that you're bad at, and you're made better off as well. But notice that implies something. Being interdependent, being economically interdependent with the rest of the world, implies that you have to give up doing a lot of things. There's a lot of things that I as an individual have given up doing. I don't fix my own car. I don't build my own house. I don't mow my own lawn. There's a lot of things that I've outsourced to other people. But that frees me up to spend all of my time concentrating on economics. And as a result, I can do better at that particular job and get more stuff and raise my own personal standard of living. But notice it implies that I've given up doing a lot of things, and that's actually the story of globalization and international trade. Now, many times, that's framed as a bad thing, even though I just said it's a good thing. It raises our standard of living. So how is that framed as a bad thing? Well, we hear about all of our jobs being outsourced to other countries, and we've struck bad deals with the rest of the world, and that they're stealing all of our jobs from us. And that's a really nice political ploy to kind of get people riled up, but it betrays the underlying logic of how global markets actually work. So that's going to be the theme as we go along here. And it's interesting to point out that there are some instances where nations have chosen that path of isolation, that path of self-reliance. A great example of a country who chose a path of self-reliance is North Korea. Matter of fact, they have a national slogan, which I can't pronounce. It's spelled something like Jute, J-U-T-G-H-E-G, I don't know. It starts with J. And Jute translates into English into self-reliance. And so that's the idea, right? They don't want to be dependent upon the rest of the world. They want to do their own thing. But that means they have to do everything for themselves. Even if they're bad at doing those things, they have to waste resources and tie up resources doing those things instead of relying on other people to do them. And there's a great example that I like to show. Let me see if I can get this to work. Oh, goodness. Is there no browser? There it is. Firefox. Let me get this pulled up. Just a very, they say a picture tells 1,000 words. North Korea at night. That's a good one. I don't know if you can see that. Nothing behind me. Oh, there it is. Let me see if this one's clearer. That's pretty good. So if you can see that, if you guys are picking that up okay in Warner Robins there. This is a map of North and South Korea. taken fairly recently, probably within the last 10 years or so. April 15th, tax day. Not sure what year.
It looks like 15.
15? Yeah, maybe. Maybe last year. So what's the deal with North and South Korea? Well, North and South Korea are a great example of what we call a natural experiment. When you do an experiment in the classroom or in a laboratory, you have to control for a lot of variables, right? You want to simplify and make sure that you're only altering one thing so you can see how that one thing makes a difference between your control group and your experimental group, right? In nature, you don't always have a good control of all your variables. There's a lot of things that can get cluttered, and then you don't know which of those variables is responsible for the difference. But with North and South Korea, it presents a really nice natural experiment. Because what do you have? You have a single country with a single language, a single history. It's a peninsular country, so it comes down here and it's the same country. And then what do we do in the 1950s? We have a war over there, and we end up cutting it in half. And we say, okay, there's going to be two Koreas now. So we've got these two identical starting points. And then what do we let happen? We let 50 years of history happen. And what's the difference? Well, South Korea embraces globalization and free trade. South Korea immerses itself in the global economy. North Korea goes back to this idea of self-reliance, of being isolated from the rest of the world and doing things all for themselves. And what's the result 55, 60 years later? This was not, hey, let's all turn out the lights night in North Korea. This is every night in North Korea. What do they not have a lot of, apparently, at night? Yeah, electricity. And what's that a proxy for? Well, that's a proxy for all kinds of economic activity, right? So if you don't have enough electricity to light up your country, how are you going to have hospitals? How are you going to have, good healthcare for people and all this kind of stuff? So, an interesting side note, I can't even see it in this map. This is Seoul, South Korea. Pyongyang, North Korea is somewhere right there, and they were about the same size 50 years ago. And you can't even see one of them now at night. And you can see one there. So if you just kind of wrap your brain around that and say, okay, granted, what's going on now? There's probably a lot more pollution and stuff like that. Maybe we'll actually talk about that later this semester. Actually, probably not actually. When you have this much economic development, you make a lot of money, and you use some of that money to clean up the environment, so you can actually get a cleaner environment from this situation rather than this situation where they're so poor they don't have the resources to clean up their messes. So, you're going to go through some growing pains with this kind of economic development and growth. You're going to have smog, you're going to have those things, but eventually those things get hammered out over time. And I think this is just a great example of how you can have a clear distinction between countries who've chosen to isolate themselves versus those who haven't. There's a few other examples. One country that fairly recently isolated itself from the rest of the world used to be called Burma. It's now called Myanmar. And they have one of the lowest standards of living on the planet. It's because they're misallocating and they're squandering their resources. Okay, so that's kind of my take on economic interdependence. And I gave you guys a statistic, and let me repeat that stat now, that roughly speaking, we're somewhere around 13 or 15% dependent upon the rest of the world for the goods and services that we consume in this country, which means, despite the fact that it feels like we're 95% dependent upon the rest of the world for all the goods and services that we consume, we're not. We have roughly an $18 trillion economy, 2016, 18.3 or something. The global economy is about 70 trillion, so we're right under a third of the global population, but we're only 5%. I'm sorry, the global economy. We're about a third of the global economy, but we're only about 5% of the global population. That gives us a very high standard of living. It also means that we're very productive. So we have not lost all of our jobs. We're winning, and it's not even close. The U.S. is the largest producer of goods and services in the world. Now, primarily what we find is that the U.S. has specialized in the production of services, and that's what you guys are studying for. You're studying to be accountants. You're studying to be marketing representatives. Other people, think of all the degrees here at Middle Georgia State University. We're offering nursing degrees, so healthcare services, education degrees, business degrees, financial services. These are all services. That's what the jobs are. That's what we're specializing. And what have we given up as a result? Yeah, we've given up on the manufacturing. And so again, that's that kind of tension that's created in from globalization and free trade. But notice we're all a lot better off for being doctors and lawyers rather than poor farmers or poor factory workers. We'll also find that in China, they're better off for having those manufacturing jobs than if they tried to do otherwise. But we'll get to that a little bit later. It still seems a little bit tricky, though, to think, wow, are we really only 13, 15% dependent upon the rest of the world for the goods and services that we consume? If you look at manufactured goods, the U.S., I think, is about third globally in manufacturing. So even though we have specialized away from manufacturing, we're still such a large producer of goods and services. We're I think, right behind Germany and China when it comes to manufactured goods. But it's not the manufactured goods that you may be thinking about. It's not the cheap electronics that you buy at Best Buy. It's not all the stuff on that half of Walmart where there's all that junk from China. They make a lot of that cheap stuff, but when it comes to heavy equipment manufacturing, high-tech equipment manufacturing, cutting-edge technology, things like that, the U.S. is still, producing a lot of that stuff. So the question is, excuse me, there's my pen. How come there's this perception that things are kind of this runaway freight train, that globalization has overrun us, that everything is being made somewhere else now and all that kind of stuff? Why does it feel like we're 95% dependent upon the rest of the world when in fact we're only about 15% dependent upon the rest of the world? And let me show you a reason for that. First, it might help to go back about 100 years. If we go back about 100 years and we say, okay, how dependent were we upon the rest of the world then? You might imagine that we weren't very dependent upon the rest of the world, and then maybe over the past 20 or 30 years it's taken off. So even though 15% isn't a big number, or 13% isn't a big number, going from 0 to 13% might seem like a big change to us, and that may be part of the perception. So if we actually do that, and let me draw a silly graph for you here. Oh no, that's not working. That's still not working. Try that. There we go. All right, let's just call this some measure of our economic interdependence, the amount of that we're dependent upon the rest of the world for the stuff that we buy. And this is going to be time down here. And let's just go 1900 to 2016, then to now. The question is, in 1900, how dependent were we upon the rest of the world for the things we buy? And if you check, it ends up being about 8%. And then you check recently, within the last 5 years or so, it was around 13%. And let's draw the graph there. That's actually 13's down here, not there. So let's just draw a graph. Does that look like rapidly increasing globalization to anybody? No, it doesn't. What's going on here? Well, globalization and being, using other countries' resources in the production process and trading with other countries is not a modern phenomenon. Matter of fact, it goes back to the first civilizations. If you go back to the early civilizations, you will see evidences of trading routes and things like that, where people from different chiefdoms or different kingdoms were trading with one another. So it's not a modern phenomenon that just happened in the last 30 years, which is the first lesson to consider. My 13% up here. 13%. Even here in middle Georgia, we've got the Okmulgee National Monument. You ever gone out there? It's an old trading route where Native American nations used to trade with one another. And there was, and then later when the Western settlers came in, same idea. So it's not a modern phenomenon, first lesson. But there's also a little bit of history we need to throw in here. Oh, there's one other thing that I'm misleading you with. Again, why it feels like we've had rapid globalization when the numbers don't really suggest that. It's also true that the global economy is a lot bigger now than it was 100 years ago. So what we're talking about is comparing 8% of a very small pie with 13% of a very large economic pie. So it's a bigger slice. So we have had an increase in volume of trade, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is our dependence upon trade, which is best measured in percentage terms. So why have we still felt like there's this rapid increase in globalization? Well, mainly because something around 1929 happened. You remember your macroeconomics. Around 1929, we had this little thing called the Great Depression. At the time, they didn't know it was the Great Depression, but it ended up being a pretty big deal. Matter of fact, it lasted until the 1940s, and then we had a World War, 1940, and then that went until 45, and so this is not to scale, but you get the idea. What's going on here? Well, something happened at the start of the Great Depression that put a halt to free trade. Countries stopped trading with one another, and the question is why? Well, whenever you have an economic downturn, there's always a tendency for nations to want to circle the wagons. If you're walking down the street, you've just lost your job because it's a recession or a Great Depression, and you work at a hat factory, and they just laid you off. And you walk down the street and you see someone wearing a hat that was made in France. How's that going to make you feel? You're a little angry about that, aren't you? You say, wait a second, if they were buying our hats and not their hats, then we'd be better off here. I'd still have my job. So there's this huge populist cry to restrict trade to preserve jobs when unemployment starts to climb during a recession. So the Great Depression was no exception, and politicians responded to this with what's called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. That's H-A-W-L-E-Y, Smoot, S-M-O-O-T, Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Smoot and Hawley were two congressmen who proposed this bill, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and it got a lot of momentum because of the Great Depression. Excuse me. And despite more than 1,000 economists signing a letter to the president saying, whatever you do, do not enact this. Free trade, I've already kind of made this point, I haven't made it formally yet, but just go with me for now. Free trade makes us better off. Guess what restricting free trade does? Even though it may not be apparent to you at this point, it is going to necessarily make us worse off. And what's the last thing we need at the beginning of the Great Depression? Government policy that's going to send us into a downward spiral. But despite that, like I said, these things get very popular during economic downturns, and it was enacted, and immediately, guess what the rest of the world did to us the second that we, oh, by the way, a tariff, which I have not explained yet, which we'll get to when we get to chapter 4, chapters 4 and 5. A tariff is a tax on imports. So if you tax imports, consumers domestically are less likely to buy those imports and more likely to buy U.S. manufactured goods or U.S. produced goods and services. So by taxing imports when they're coming into this country, it hurts not only us, actually, it hurts other countries. And guess how they retaliate? Yeah, they do countervailing tariffs. They come out and they say, okay, you're going to tax our stuff, we're going to tax your stuff. Pretty soon what you had was, on average, about 70% tariffs across the board on all goods and services between all major trading countries in the world. And guess what that did to globalization and free trade? It just shut it down. It was completely shut down. So what that did was, right when we need the ability not only to buy cheap things from the rest of the world because people's incomes are hurting, those have been cut off. Not only that, when we need jobs, we can't export anything to the rest of the world. We can't grow our export sector because the rest of the world has engaged in what we call a trade war. By the way, that always happens. This is completely predictable, and it's silly. It's lunacy that these things are ever passed, but they are. And we'll talk about that a lot this semester, about that tension. And it's the reason is because there's a political incentive to do so. Even though it's extremely painful economically, there's a lot of political gains to be made from these types of policies. So what did that do? Well, this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but it kind of dropped this didn't happen here. We didn't have that. we didn't have a whole lot of trade going on, and then through 1940, 1945, with the World War, countries aren't trading with one another, they're fighting. And then something happens after World War II. Between 45 and 1950, world leaders got together in this small New Hampshire town called Bretton Woods at the Mount Washington Resort. Nice place. And they sent delegates, world leaders sent delegates from around the world, and they got together and they started hammering out some international institutions. Now, when we get to chapter 9, later we'll talk in depth about these institutions, but just so you know what those institutions are today, one is the World Trade Organization, one is the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank also came out of this era. They also established an exchange rate system that we'll talk about later at the Bretton Woods, and it's referred to as the Bretton Woods system. And all of these ideas were there to foster and bring back free trade. So after 15 years of no trade, 15 years of fighting wars, trade wars, and military wars, world leaders got together and said, we can't do this anymore. This is killing us, literally and figuratively. And so what did they do? They enacted policies that rejuvenated free trade. And that's what we'll talk about when we get to the World Trade Organization. Its sole purpose is to get countries trading with one another again and prevent them from having trade wars. And guess what that does from 1950 to the present day? That kind of gets us back to where we should have been in the first place. And so now maybe we do kind of see kind of rapidly increasing globalization over the past 30 or 40 years. So maybe our perception is not all that off, because you have to account for history when you look at what's going on there. That's kind of a made-up graph, but it works. Economists make up a lot of graphs. Come on. So when we look at countries like North Korea and South Korea, one way of defining their attitude towards globalization and free trade is to refer to North Korea as being a closed economy and South Korea as being an open economy. So open economies trade with other countries, and closed economies are isolationist or self-reliant, don't depend on other countries any bit. We can actually measure openness in a few different ways, and one way is with trade flows. So that 13 to 15% number I gave you was a measurement of trade flows, and we do that with what's called an index of openness. And an index of openness, called I, is equal to the value of imports plus the value of exports all over GDP, the size of the economy. So an index of openness measures the fraction of our total economy that's accounted for between imports and exports. Now, the bigger that number is, the more you are dependent upon other countries for the goods and services that you consume in your economy. It can be the case that you got to be careful here. An index of openness doesn't measure your attitude towards trade, whether you want to trade or not want to trade. It just simply measures how much you trade. So, for instance, Japan actually politically has a somewhat closed attitude towards globalization and free trade. Now, they sure enough like to export to the rest of the world, but one thing they hate to do is import. So they pretty much have closed off half of free trade in their country. They're always thinking of tricky ways to restrict imports into their country. So we refer to that as protectionist policies. We'll talk about those throughout the semester as well. But the fact is that Japan still trades with a lot of the world. So even though they have kind of a closed attitude towards trade, they actually have a very high index of openness. So got to be careful with reading too much into these measures. You could also, for instance, have a very open attitude. You want to trade with the rest of the world, but you're just an isolated small island nation that's so remote you don't trade a lot. So you could have a very small index of openness but have a good attitude towards it. So trade flows is one way. Uh-oh. That happened. Factor flows is another thing we'll talk about this semester. It's another way of measuring openness, the first way being trade flows and then factor flows. As you recall from the principles, factor flows are the factors of production, land, labor, and capital. And just like final goods and services, like this backpack, can move across the border, so can labor resources, so can factories, so can raw materials. For all intents and purposes, it works just like free trade, but it brings up more political issues such as immigration. And think about our attitude towards immigration these days. And think about historically what our attitude has been in this country. And that's kind of the interesting discussion here. Prior to 9/11, even long before that probably, we were a nation that had a very open attitude towards immigration. And if you think about our history, what are we? I mean, we're a nation of immigrants, aren't we? How has that attitude changed? Are we open now? What's the big political battle cry right now? What do we want to build? We want to build a wall and prevent immigrants from coming in, right? So now we've become closed. So you got to be careful here because the economics are pretty straightforward. You want resources to flow to their highest valued use, whether it's in this country or another. And if there's a surplus of labor in Mexico and a shortage of a particular type of labor in this country, it's economically efficient to have that labor move from point A to point B. Now, it's politically sensitive. So it's another situation where we kind of get caught between politics and economics. And I want to be careful with that because when I talk about open borders being economically efficient, I'm not making a political statement, I'm making an economic statement. So just be aware of that. I understand that there are also political considerations. There's all kinds of issues, especially post 9/11, if you talk about terrorism and the need to control our borders and make sure that terrorists don't just freely come into our country. That's obviously a political consideration. That's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about immigrant workforce. The majority of people that immigrate into this country for jobs are perfectly law-abiding citizens, or as much as you and I are, at least. They probably speed a little bit and do all the little things we do. If you look at the business school here at Middle Georgia State University, have you noticed that not all the professors are from around here? They may have us. If you start counting the number of foreign professors, Francisco Lopez, Cynthia, our dean was born in India, Cynthia's in India. We got a Canadian, I don't name names, we got a Canadian, we have someone from the islands. We got people from all over the dang place. There's only a few of us that are from the States. This is not a political problem to have a professor from Spain teaching at our school. It's a perfectly valid economic reason for that. So that's the distinction we want to make. Now, if they were coming over to blow up our buildings, that's a political consideration, but that's not what most immigrants are doing. But we will talk about those issues, and there are some issues in particular with low-skilled labor immigrating into this country because they bring with them a host of social needs. They still need hospital care, they still need education, but if they're low-skilled, low-income workers, they're not really contributing, so they can be kind of a drain on resources. And that's why we tend to have laws that discriminate against low-skilled workers entering the country, whereas high-skilled workers are encouraged. The third is price convergence. One way of measuring openness, besides looking at factor flows and trade flows, is with price convergence. When countries trade with one another, you get a unified market. And one characteristic of unified markets is you get the same price. So Macon there's a market in Macon for gasoline. And what do you notice about gasoline prices pretty much all over town compared, let's say, with Manhattan? Yeah, the ones in town are very similar. There's going to be some variation. The farther out in the country, the more competition you have locally. There's going to be a few little factors that cause variation. But single markets tend to have homogenized prices. So when two countries are open with one another, their prices will converge, whereas when they're separate, the prices will diverge. A great example of that is Cuban cigars. Recently, the laws have been relaxed a little bit. You used to not be able to buy Cuban cigars anywhere in the world. Now you can buy them in Europe, but you can't bring them back into the States yet. You have to smoke them while you're in Europe, but at least that's legal now. But what's the difference? If you go to Havana and you buy a Cuban cigar, you're going to pay $1 for it, maybe $5. That same cigar in the U.S., if you can find one, is going to cost you $100, $50 to $100. Those prices are divergent. Why? Because we're closed. We have an embargo against Cuba still that prevents the free flow of goods and services between the two nations. Once that embargo is finally lifted, which it probably will be within the next few years, guess what will happen with the price of Cuban cigars both here and in Cuba? They'll converge. They'll have to converge because all of those cheap cigars will flow out of the country, which will create more scarcity of cigars in Cuba, raising the price, but it'll create a more abundance of those cigars outside of Cuba, which will lower the price effectively there. And that's your price convergence. In the notes here, I have factor mobility. This is just, that was factor flows, what I just said right there. Okay, so how does free trade operate? How does free trade function? One other way that you've been misled your whole life is that you should be the best. You should be competitive. I don't know, if you were playing football or something when you were in high school and your dad was really pushing you and he was wanting you to be the quarterback and saying, okay, you got to do your best. You got to work harder than everybody else. You got to be the best, right? We have this competitive edge in this country. Everything's based on competition in this country. We even get mad when they start handing out certificates of participation. Because what do we want to see? We want to see people win, right? And if you're going to lose, fine. Try harder next time, right? We've got this real, competitive spirit in this country, and that served us very well. And you do want to see competition in the market between companies. You want to see competition among students for grades. You want to see this competition is healthy. It creates a better outcome typically. The problem is that free trade does not operate based on the laws of competitiveness. They operate on a more subtle law referred to as the law of comparative advantage. And without getting too deep into it in this introductory part, what I will say about it is this. It's the opposite of what you may think. Free trade does not operate based on what you do the best. It operates on what you give up doing when you specialize in whatever direction you choose to specialize in. So it's not about how productive you are at something. It's about how costly is it in terms of the things you're giving up. This results in a lot of interesting little side stories. So for instance, in the US, we are very competitive globally at manufacturing. The problem is we're so much better at the service industries that when we take resources away from the service industry to do manufacturing, even though we may be better at it than other countries, it's too costly in terms of what we're giving up. And since other countries can handle the manufacturing for us, it doesn't cost us a lot to give that up. So thinking in terms of what you give up is sometimes more important than what you're actually doing. The example I give in class is me choosing to be an economist. I am not the best economist in the world. I'm not very competitive, matter of fact, as an economist. And I know that because they rank us. Well, they rank the top 2,000, and guess which list I'm not on? I'm not in the top 2,000. I doubt I'm 2001. I doubt I just missed it. The rankings are comprised of a specific set of criteria, some of which I have not focused on in my career. I've done more applied economics research instead of academic research, and so I have some really valid excuses as to why I'm not on that list. But I do know some people who are high on that list. I knew someone who was as high as 17 on that list. He might be higher now. Since I'm recording this, I won't say who it is. And I won't say that I really know him. I met him. Another guy that I'm working with is probably in the top 500, and one of my former professors was maybe a top 200, 250, somewhere in there. So I have touched greatness, even if I have not achieved it myself. There's one common theme about all of these very highly rated economists that's universal about them. Guess what they do all day long? Economics. Guess what they do all night long? Economics. I've been at seminars on Fridays with some of these guys, and after the seminar they go out and they're drinking beers, and guess what they're talking about? Economics. And then go to dinner, and guess what they're talking about? Economics. And I'm sitting there thinking, NBA playoffs are going on right now. Anybody want to talk about the game? What do you think LeBron's going to do tonight? Guess what they don't have time for? Any of that. It's too costly for them to waste time talking about basketball, because if they're not spending all of their time, they can't be competitive. If they're not focused singularly on economics. One story that I tell, I was at that same dinner many years ago, very highly rated economist sitting there, and as we're sitting there, he gets a call on his cell phone. He's like, yep, hello, all right, bye, and hangs up. And I was like, hey, here's something else I can talk about besides economics. Who was that? He goes, that was my wife. She just gave birth to our first child. I'm like, and you're having drinks with me? And nobody, it's like, what do you have to give up to be that good as an economist? You have to give up everything, don't you? I knew that day that I would not ever be on that list because I'm not willing to give up that much. It's too costly for me. So that doesn't mean that I can't be a very productive economist, though, that I can't specialize and teach classes and find my niche and do things very well within this industry. It's just a matter of what you give up. So the reason I'm an economist is not so much because I'm competitive as an economist. It's actually the case that I'm so bad at everything else. What am I giving up to be an economist? Nothing. I'm not very good at brain surgery. I'm not very good at any job that requires you be there from 9 to 5, which is most of them. I'm bad at those kind of jobs. So what am I giving up? Nothing. So I want you to kind of chew on that for a while and think about that as we go forward. It's not what you do, it's what you give up that matters. And that's the best I can kind of introduce the law of comparative advantage to you, and we'll get to that later. Even early economists thought it was about how productive you were, not the cost. It took 20 or 30 years of economists thinking about it before we realized, oh wait, it's not what you do that matters, it's what you give up that matters. So countries specialize in things not because they're the best at it, they specialize in things because it doesn't cost them a lot to do so. There are a lot of forces out there that are opposed to free trade. I'm not going to make any qualms about it. All semester long, you'll hear me. I'm a free trade economist. I will talk about how great free markets are. There's also a group of people who are opposed to free trade. I've already mentioned some of them. I said that there's people in Japan who don't feel like they should import, and I've referred to them collectively as protectionists. And protectionists are those isolationists, the ones who want to restrict trade. And they usually have a pretty strong argument that if we restrict trade, it'll save jobs. We'll get into a lot of detail about that, and that's not altogether untrue. The problem is that when we protect our borders to save jobs, we don't just materialize labor resources out of thin air. We have to take them from somewhere. And if we're already operating efficiently, when we have to take resources away from efficient production to do stuff that we're not very good at doing, guess what? It kills us on both sides. It's a tough lesson to learn. It's very counterintuitive. It's much easier to say, hey, if we put up big walls, then we'll have more jobs. That sounds real simple and straightforward. It's just wrong. It's not the way it works. So I will be talking about protectionists all semester long, and I'll refer to them as the bad guys. Luckily, there's protectionists on all sides of the political aisle this year. Both Republicans and Democrats have taken up this battle cry, both Bernie and Trump. When people are watching this in the future, they will know who our next president is, even though we don't know who it is yet. So a lot of people argue that we should restrict trade because it's going to help us out somehow. All of those arguments are based on logical mistakes that people make in their argument, either intentionally or accidentally. And we refer to those as fallacies. Fallacies are logical errors. And if you look on Wikipedia under fallacies, there's a list of formal and informal fallacies, just 50 or 60, 70 of these various fallacies. And they all have to do with making a logical error in a formal statement. There's fallacy of composition is one of the fallacies in there. Fallacy of composition is what's true of a part is not necessarily true of the whole. That's basically the stereotyping fallacy. Just because you know one jerk doesn't mean that everybody who has a similar characteristic as that jerk is also a jerk. But the thing about fallacies is they trick you because they're kind of intuitively appealing, even though they're not correct altogether. There's a fallacy. Begging the question is a fallacy, and you should know that one as well. It's a form of circular reasoning. It's assuming the conclusion. People do that one. It's very subtle, and it can trick people into believing an argument, even though that argument makes no sense. So that's kind of the idea of fallacies. And so what are some of the trade fallacies? What are some of these illogical arguments that people put forth on behalf of their position that we should restrict free trade? One is that trade is a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game is any activity where the end result is there's no gain to either party. In other words, the gains to the winners of a zero-sum game come at the expense of the losers. So what are some examples of zero-sum games? Gambling is a zero-sum game. Theft is a zero-sum game. If I steal $100 from you, I'm $100 better off, you're $100 worse off. That's a zero-sum game. There's also negative-sum games, where the interaction actually produces a net loss. And that would be an example of, say, armed robbery with battery, where not only do I take $100 from you, but I beat the crap out of you, and I put you in the hospital, and you incur $500 worth of hospital bills. So you've lost $600, and I've only gained $100. And there's a net loss of $500 there from that activity. That's an example of a negative-sum game. Free trade is neither of those. The thing about zero-sum games and negative-sum games, if you may have picked up on those, they're kind of bad things, aren't they? The things like gambling and theft and armed robbery. These are zero-sum games and negative-sum games. And so what do we do with most of those zero-sum games and negative-sum games politically? What do we do with those? We make them illegal, right? We cut them off. Well, if you can convince people that free trade is a zero-sum game, guess what you can argue? Well, just like theft, we should cut it off. They're winning at our expense, so we need to cut that out. Trade is a positive-sum game. There are, in fact, winners and losers from free trade, but what we will find this semester is that the gains to the winners always exceed the losses to the losers. What you typically have is two countries engaged in free trade. You will have winners and losers in each country, but more winners than losers. So if you restrict free trade, you go the other way. You create more losers than winners. So I'm not saying that everything is peachy keen, that everything is perfect with free trade. Free trade does mean that we're going to reshuffle our jobs. Free trade does mean that there's going to be some people winning and some people losing. But if you remain agnostic, you have to step back and say, okay, I'm not going to pick sides here. There are gains from trade. That's all we can really say about that. There's another common fallacy that imports are bad and exports are good. Excuse me. This comes from the idea that if we import something, we lose those jobs. But if we export something, it creates jobs. So if we increase our exports, we have to make more stuff. The thing about this one, imports hurting the economy and exports helping the economy, it's only partially true. It turns out that imports do hurt producers in this country. If you're producing something If you make backpacks and we start importing backpacks from another country, that's more competition from you. It's going to hurt you. But it's the consumers that are going to win from that competition. They're going to see lower prices. They're going to see better quality. They're going to see different choices. And so there's gains to the consumers from imports and there's losses to the producers. And what I'll show to you later is that actually those gains to the consumers outweigh the losses to the producers. How about on the export side? On the export side, it's the exact opposite. Exports help the producers. Exports allow the producers to sell more. But if we're selling all of our stuff to other countries, guess what you can't do as a consumer? You can't buy it. Yeah, so you're actually, as a consumer, exports hurt you. It creates more competition for the goods and services that you also value. But, as in the case with imports, exports, the gains to the producers outweigh the losses to the consumers. So in both cases, there are winners and losers. But you see this one a lot. There's also another reason for this we'll get into later, and it has to do with how we measure GDP. And it's caused a problem with people buying into this argument. Even good economists fall prey to that sometimes. The last one is that trade barriers will somehow protect our jobs. I've talked about tariffs today, and this is the last thing we're going to talk about in this lecture, so thanks for hanging in there. The idea that you can restrict trade with a tariff, a tax on imports, there's also other trade barriers like quotas, and there's even subsidies and other things we'll talk about later where you can impact or restrict trade. The idea is that it's supposed to save jobs, and it will protect jobs in a specific industry. So for example, in 2001, 2002, the president enacted steel tariffs. They were like 40% on all imported steel. That arguably saved somewhere in the vicinity of 7,000 or 8,000 steelworker jobs in this country. Because without that competition from overseas, we had to make more steel, and that brought people back to work. Very convenient that was midterm elections when that was happening in the Midwest where the steel industry is. And that's a good way to go out and get votes, is to help people out with their jobs. But the problem is, by putting a 40% tax on imported steel, what happened to the price of cars that use steel as part of the manufacturing process? Now that the automobile manufacturers have to pay an additional 40% for their steel. Yeah. Now, when U.S. trucks are a little more expensive than, say, a Japanese truck, guess what consumers at the margin, some will do? They'll buy the Japanese instead of the U.S., all else being equal. And then what happens to the auto worker's job? He loses it. Okay, so it's a richer story. Yes, you will save specific jobs, and that's the thing that we see. Economics is always about the seen versus the unseen. The thing you see are the 7,500 steelworker jobs that are saved. What you don't see are the 70,000 other jobs that were lost because of the increase in steel prices in this country. Not only that, consumers, if they're paying more in a tax, they're buying less, they're going out to dinner less. And what happens to the guy working at a restaurant? He loses his job. He doesn't even know why he lost his job. He won't connect to that it was because steel prices were higher and that caused household consumption to be diverted a different direction. So we got there. The last thing I was doing when the recording device cut off on me, and as a quick review of where we were last week, we were talking as trade as a threat to jobs, and the idea that if we use some kind of protective tariff, which is what we're going to be talking about in Chapter 4, and then also some non-tariff trade barriers, other ways of restricting trade in Chapter 5. When we get to that, we'll be talking about how those mechanisms are very effective. These are public policy objectives. Politicians enact these things, and they are taxes. Typically, a tariff is a tax on consumers when they purchase something imported from another country. So just like anything that you purchase, if I raise the price on you, you're less likely to buy it. So the tax effectively raises the price of the import, and prevents U.S. consumers from purchasing it. Or if they do purchase it, they pay a heavy tax. Those taxes, as you can see, can be very high. They can be as high as 70 or 100%. And if you think about taxes in general, that's an extremely high sales tax. In the local market in Middle Georgia, we have about 7% sales tax, which is a local tax that funds a big part of our city governments or city county consolidated governments. And if they try to raise that sales tax from 6% to 7% or 7% to 8%, people get pretty up in arms about that. It's very difficult politically to get that done. But these tariffs are just passed by the federal government many times without any discussion, any knowledge by the consumers. We'll talk about that later. How much you actually pay in tariffs that you were completely unaware of. And I know you're unaware of it because until I realized it and found out a few years ago, I was completely unaware of how much I was paying each year in tariffs. But these can be extremely high taxes. And what these trade barriers do collectively, whether it's a quota or a tariff or whatever, they all seem to work the same. What these restrictive tariffs do is they either, one, prevent you from buying something, or two, force you to pay an exorbitant tax when you do buy something. That will, in effect, protect domestic industry from these lower-priced imports. So if a domestic firm is having a problem competing with a cheap import, the solution is to make the import less cheap. And that allows domestic firms, U.S. firms, to hire workers back that they may have laid off, and it protects those jobs. The problem is it's not free. The idea that this is just some kind of free protection of jobs is completely false. Who's paying for those jobs? Well, U.S. taxpayers are. So as a consumer, you're either going to pay a higher tax for an import, or you're going to pay a higher price for a U.S.-produced good. In either case, that's money coming out of your pocket that you can't spend somewhere else. And it's that opportunity cost of those funds that are going elsewhere that are the real cost of that tariff. And what that means is that you may not be going out to dinner as much, so someone in the restaurant industry loses their job. You may not buy a car, so someone in the automotive industry loses their job. So these jobs that we saved are not free. They come at the cost of other jobs. And when you do the math, what we'll find later on this semester is that the cost of these tariffs are exorbitant. You end up losing more jobs than you save. And that kind of makes sense if you think about it, because my lesson to you guys this whole semester is going to be that free trade makes us better off. So if you restrict it, guess what? You're going to be made worse off. And how does that come to fruition? How is that realized? It's realized with higher unemployment and things like that. The economy shrinks. So that's going to be the lesson. That's the only part that we missed in that previous lecture. So if you were watching these lectures online and you saw that all of a sudden we cut off, that's all you missed right at the end there.